With years gone by since the very messy and deadly U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, concern is mounting that the war-torn nation is once again emerging as a dangerous breeding ground for Al-Qaeda and other extremist terror groups such as Islamic State-Khorasan Province, or ISIS-K. While foreign policy discussions in Washington are dominated by talk of great power competition and China, a new era is afoot in the global war on terror amid a wave of increasingly sophisticated jihadist propaganda, an expanding network of terror proxy groups backed by Iran, and a growing threat of surprise ISIS-K attacks on the international stage. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at The Washington Times, and for this edition of the Threat Status Influencers series, we're at the Atlantic Council with U.S. Ambassador Nathan Sales, a preeminent expert on counterterrorism and a former Undersecretary of State who served as Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism in the U.S. government from 2017 to 2021. Ambassador, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here.
Let's jump right into this. It's been about 13 years since U.S. Special Forces killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. It's been more than 6 years since Abu Bakr Baghdadi's Islamic State Caliphate was crushed in the Middle East. It seemed like the U.S. was finally winning the war on terror decades into the post-9/11 era, but where are we now? Has America lost its footing on global counterterrorism as it focuses on other threats?
You know, I think, Guy, we're starting to take our eye off the ball, and that's a very dangerous place for the United States to be in. So there's a couple things going on here. First of all, the overwhelming priority in Washington when it comes to national security and foreign policy is China. China represents the pacing challenge to the United States. It will be pressing us on all angles of national power for the foreseeable future. And China is really the only competitor that the United States has ever faced that is able to go toe-to-toe with us economically, diplomatically, technologically, increasingly, and worryingly, militarily. So that's got to be the top priority. Another thing, however, that's going on that doesn't have to happen is the Biden administration has made a number of critical missteps when it comes to terrorist threats that we're facing around the world. The three hotspots for terrorism right now globally are Afghanistan, Iran, and the Middle East broadly, and West Africa. And in each of those situations, each of those regions, we are facing counterterrorism problems that are the inevitable and necessary result of certain policy choices made here in Washington. When it comes to Afghanistan, the calamitous withdrawal several years ago basically handed the keys to the Taliban, and they have never given up their strategic partnership with Al-Qaeda. Just a couple of weeks ago, we saw a United Nations report indicating that Al-Qaeda has now established, I think, 8 terrorist training camps across Afghanistan, not to mention ISIS-Khorasan Province, which of course is a sworn enemy of the Taliban, but the Taliban is not really good at doing counterterrorism. They're trying to pressure ISIS-K, but they're not that good at it. They're fundamentally a terrorist group and an insurgency, and they're not really capable yet of making the shift to governing. So that's Afghanistan. In Iran, the Biden administration came into office several years ago with a single-minded focus on enticing the Islamic Republic back into a nuclear deal, a flawed nuclear deal in my view. And as a result, they have had to look the other way on a wide range of malign behavior by Iran, whether it's their ballistic missile program, which has accelerated, their enrichment of uranium, which is dramatically accelerated under this administration, and their support for terror proxies across the Middle East in places like the West Bank, in Gaza, in places like Iraq, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the list goes on. It's hard to think of a Middle Eastern terrorist group that is not supported by the Islamic Republic of Iran. And then in West Africa, just to round out the tour of the region, you've seen a real uptick in violence by a number of terrorist organizations, some linked with Al-Qaeda, some linked with ISIS. A number of West African governments have succumbed to coups because the governments previously in place were not capable of adequately addressing the threat to the population posed by these groups. The Biden administration got dealt a pretty weak hand in this region, but they made some bad choices that have compounded the problems. And instead of the United States being the counterterrorism partner of choice in West Africa, you're starting to see China move in, you're starting to see Russia and the Wagner group of mercenaries move in. So when we talk about great power competition being the top priority, that's absolutely right. Part of the way we're supposed to compete against China, part of the way we compete against Russia, is by providing counterterrorism assistance in vulnerable states like in West Africa to show them that the United States can help them in ways that other countries can't.
Let's talk about ISIS-K. Recent years have seen this group grow in reach and sophistication and external attack capability. That was demonstrated in March by the massacre at a concert hall on the outskirts of Moscow in Russia. It was also demonstrated by a major attack earlier this year by ISIS-K inside Iran at a military funeral. A lot of nuances there because ISIS-K is a Sunni Muslim extremist group, whereas Iran is a Shiite theocracy. We saw warnings from U.S. CENTCOM Commander Michael Kurilla a couple of months ago, right before the Moscow attack, that ISIS-K was suddenly on the radar of the Pentagon, that its external attack capability was something that we had to be paying very close attention to. Why did he make that warning when he did, and how did we get to this point?
You know, I think the reason why ISIS-K is now in a position to carry out external operations across the region is because there's no counterterrorism pressure on ISIS-K anymore. When the United States was present in Afghanistan, even with a small, relatively small force, we had the ability to collect information on ISIS-K. We had local partner forces that we could work with to carry out operations against ISIS-K. We had drones, we had other strike assets, and that's how you degrade a terrorist group. Constant pressure, pressuring them through kinetic measures, drone strikes, but also law enforcement operations to arrest people, financial and sanctions pressure to drive the sources of money, and so on. All of that is gone now that the United States is gone.
During the lead up to the very difficult U.S. military pullout in 2021, as the Taliban threatened to take over, has since taken over, we heard testimony from Biden administration officials about how the U.S. military didn't need to be on the ground inside Afghanistan to retain over-the-horizon capability, as it was called. And in the 3 years since then, by our reporting at the Washington Times, there's been one over-the-horizon U.S. drone strike inside Afghanistan. Were the American people duped on this or sold a bogus policy? Does over-the-horizon work? Is it possible to carry out reconnaissance and surveillance and have an effective counterterrorism policy if you're not on the ground?
Unfortunately, this is not the only thing Joe Biden has gotten wrong in his 3.5 years in office. Over the horizon is a farce. It simply doesn't work. If you want to degrade a terrorist group, look, it's not rocket science. The United States has been doing this for 20-some years since 9/11. We've gotten pretty good at it. We know what works, and we know what doesn't work. And flying drones into Afghanistan from hundreds of miles away from our military bases in the Middle East, it's no substitute for actually being present. Now, that doesn't mean you need tens of thousands of American soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan. It means you probably need about 2,500. That's what we had at the end of the Trump administration, and that's actually what some of Biden's advisors in the military and diplomatic worlds were telling him was necessary in order to maintain stability in Afghanistan, keep our embassy open, and have enough military and intelligence presence that you can still do operations against ISIS-K or Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups. The term of art in the community, in the national security community, is find, fix, and finish. You have to identify where the targets are located. That's fine. Fix, you have to develop a pattern of life. You have to know what time of day they're getting up, when they're going to get milk at the grocery store, when they're dropping their kids off, when they're going to the bank, because that helps you plan when you can carry out a strike operation with the absolute minimum risk of civilian casualties. And then finish. If you don't have boots on the ground, you can't do find, you can't do fix, and it's really hard to do finish.
When you were at the State Department, you oversaw a resurgence in counter propaganda or counter messaging efforts by the U.S. and its allies in the Middle East against ISIS. Right now, ISIS-K is pushing radicalization propaganda online in a lot of languages. We actually heard a warning from Frank McKenzie, a former CENTCOM commander, about this recently, about the increasing sophistication of ISIS-K propaganda spreading across Eastern Europe, spreading to Asia. Is the U.S. doing enough on that front to stay on top of the counter messaging?
I don't think we're doing enough. So ISIS-K is using the internet to propagandize and radicalize and recruit in much the same way that main ISIS did in Syria and Iraq back in 2014 when it first burst onto the scene. ISIS was using very effective and innovative ways of reaching populations all over the world. And so ISIS was able to draw tens of thousands of foreign fighters from places like North Africa, the Middle East, Western Europe, even the United States, into Syria, into Iraq at the height of its so-called caliphate. What we're seeing now is ISIS-Khorasan Province, the affiliate in Afghanistan, using some of the same techniques to radicalize and recruit. And so you're seeing fighters come into Afghanistan from Central Asia, from Russia, and the United States is not maybe directly exposed to that risk today. ISIS-K, as far as we know, doesn't really have the ability to hit the U.S. homeland, but they're certainly trying. That's the sort of aspirational goal for any jihadi group, is to be able to hit the far enemy, the United States, at home.
There's also a European threat as we head into the 2024 Summer Olympics in France. Are you watching that threat, and how does ISIS-K factor into that? Is that something that the Europeans are prepared for?
It's something they should be preparing for, and they're spending a lot of effort to address that threat. We know that ISIS-K already has the ability to do external operations. You know, we talked about the attack in Moscow. There was an attack by ISIS-K in Iran. We've seen attacks across the border into Pakistan. It's not inconceivable that ISIS-K would have the ability to carry out an operation in Europe.
One of the more vexing aspects of the ISIS-K phenomena is that the group is not just bent on attacking Westerners, it's targeting U.S. adversaries and enemies, Iran and Russia. Is it possible for the United States to have a productive counterterrorism relationship with Moscow and Tehran?
Not really. In my experience, the kind of CT cooperation you can have with adversary states like this is really 1 inch deep. Because typically our rival states, China, Russia, Iran, not really serious about counterterrorism. They will make gestures in the direction of counterterrorism concerns, but it's really a cover for advancing their underlying strategic interests. So back in 2014, 2015, when ISIS has taken over huge swaths of territory in Syria, Russia goes in, purportedly as part of a counterterrorism mission. But they weren't really interested in fighting ISIS at all. What they were interested in doing was propping up their client, Bashar al-Assad, in the course of his brutal civil war against his own civilian population. So we are capable of doing inch-deep counterterrorism cooperation with these hostile adversary states, but it really doesn't get beyond that. What it looks like in practice is duty to warn and deconfliction.
Let's actually look at Iran for a second. We recently had the surprise death of Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash. I want to get your take on how that might impact Iran's support of proxies, this ongoing war between Israel and Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, threatening a war with Israel as well, the Houthi attacks that are ongoing against global shipping. How does the Raisi death impact Iran's relationship with its proxies?
It's not going to make a difference. So let's start with basics. Iran is the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism. They have been since the Islamic Republic came into power back in 1979. They're not going to change with the coming or going of a particular office holder. The person who holds real power there's two people that matter in Tehran. One of them is the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and the other is the leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, their sort of external operations paramilitary organization. And those are the people who are responsible for Iran's extensive use and support for terror proxies across the region. When it comes to Hamas, which is responsible for the October 7 atrocities in Israel, Hamas has received hundreds of millions of dollars a year from Tehran. Hezbollah, the Lebanese terror group on the northern border of Israel, it's received even more lavish support from Iran. The Houthi rebels in Yemen, which are attacking commercial shipping and also lobbing rockets and missiles and Iranian-made drones into Israel, obviously are receiving extensive support from the Iranians. All of this comes from the very top. It comes from the supreme leader. It comes from the Quds Force. Raisi, as a president of Iran, is kind of a figurehead. He's not the person who's responsible.
Some have argued that Raisi was almost somewhat of a civilian buffer, preventing a total IRGC takeover of the government function under the supreme leader. With him out of the way, is there a bigger threat of an IRGC control in Tehran?
I'm not sure how much more control the IRGC could have. They are already calling the shots when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to their export of the Shia revolution through violent means. They control much of the Iranian economy, for that matter. The IRGC is so intertwined with various industries across the entire economy that it's almost like a mafia-run state.
Ambassador Nathan Sales, so interesting, so insightful. Thank you so much for joining me for this edition of the Threat Status Influencers series. I'm Guy Taylor. Until next time.